organizations. As we said, we make up for the lack of the 3% federal tax credit by the fact that we're cost 30% less than probably the next best option that they would encounter with a for-profit installer. And then of course the other benefit is that we're training people for the new green economy. So probably 80% of our installations, if not more, are the homeowners, and then 20% are nonprofit organizations. This is actually for the Central Coast. We have a pretty well-established organization in the Bay Area. I only recently expanded to the Central Coast, and this is actually my first nonprofit installation that I'm running, hopefully the first of many. But it is a smaller portion of what we do. But what they lack in the number of systems we install, they make up for in system size. This is going to be close to a 10 kilowatt system that we're installing today. But just to kind of touch on the economics of why should someone have less than a $100 bill? Why does that make sense for Sunwork and not make sense for the for-profit companies? It has a lot to do with the tier system that PG&E uses. The fact that in Tier 1, at that kind of below baseline, the electricity rates are relatively cheap, emphasis on relatively. But Tier 2, it goes up a bit, and then you get to Tier 3 where it's a more punishing rate, and oftentimes the people who are in Tier 2 and Tier 3, they stand to benefit the most from getting solar because they're paying already the most for solar electricity. And it kind of works in reverse when you get solar. If you get solar that covers half of your needs, it's going to eat from the top tier back. So the payback can be really good even and still leave room for a normal company to make a profit and still save the customer money. So Sunworks market is trying to cover people who are mostly in baseline, maybe a little bit in Tier 2. That's that under $100 mark. And then the traditional solar market, we try not to actually compete with the regular solar installers who are also doing good work. What we're trying to do is get more solar out there in general that would not have otherwise been installed. So we don't want to just replace one solar with another. We want to get actually new installations out there by covering this untapped potential right here. So some highlights about Sunwork. We got our start in 2009. We do 2 to 4 installations each weekend if you count the Bay Area. I do 1 installation each weekend myself, and then that's usually in the San Luis Obispo County area. Probably well over 575 installations now, tons of trained volunteers, and we get excellent reviews. Even though we're training people each time, we also take our time with the installations, and I think our customers really appreciate that we're not doing rush jobs on these. We're not trying to get to the next project, We're actually, we'll take how many days it needs to get the installation done right and do the one-on-one training with people, make sure that everyone knows what they're doing. So here's some examples of other nonprofit installations. This is a big 20.5 kilowatt system, DC, meaning that it has a central inverter. We'll talk more about that as we get further into the training. What is the difference between a central inverter versus, say, microinverters like we're installing today? Here's another example, 105 panels for 29 kilowatts total. So actually, as far as nonprofits go, this is relatively on the small side. It would be big by the standards of a single home, but as nonprofits go, it's still under 10 kilowatts. So they can go pretty big. Just to give you guys a little bit of background, most of our installations happen on Saturday and Sunday. We're kind of taking advantage of the full 3-day weekend today, but some people wonder, well, what do I do with the rest of my week? And there's a lot of other things that happen in the background, like just qualifying people. Lisa helps a lot with that. Assuming someone gets qualified, I get sent out and do the design, like a site survey to measure out where the panels will fit, come up with a quote for the customer, and eventually a contract if they decide to move forward. I'm in charge of the permit application with the city, ordering materials, all the logistics to make sure that everything goes smoothly on the weekend installation. And then afterwards, there's also electrical hookups, monitoring, getting an inspection from the city, and then finally getting everything right with the power company so that there's permission to operate. then turning the system on and letting the customer enjoy their new source of renewable energy. So let's go into an intro to kind of touch on solar energy. First of all, what is energy? And I'll kind of throw this to the room. Does anyone have ideas, like what would be your definition of energy?
The ability to do work.
Perfect. That's the most common kind of catch-all definition of energy is simply the ability to do work. And what are some different forms of energy? Just like general categories, maybe. Kinetic energy.
Potential energy.
Nuclear, yeah. And just to put them in really broad categories, you might say mechanical, chemical, thermal, electrical, magnetic. Of course, electrical is the one we're going to focus on today. And then what about power? How is power different from energy?
Sounds like it's a measurement of how much work you can do.
Sort of. It's actually how quickly you can execute the work. It's energy over time, and power and energy get used pretty interchangeably, so it's easy to get the terms mixed up. And the terms that power and energy are measured in, kilowatts or kilowatt hours, are at least as if not more confusing as well. So, does anyone know, like, what is power measured in? Is it kilowatts or kilowatt hours? Kilowatts. That's right. So, because a watt is actually a joule per second, so that is a unit of power. It's got a built-in kind of divide by time built in there that's kind of hidden. That's what creates kind of the confusion. Then when you want to convert back to energy, which is the total amount of power over a length of time, then you have to multiply the hours back in there, so you come up with watt hours or thousands of watt hours, like a kilowatt hour. So who knows, does PG&E charge you for power, or do they charge you for energy? Energy. That's right. They bill you in kilowatt hours. They charge you for energy. So solar energy, of course, comes from the sun. What are some other sources of energy, maybe not directly from the sun? Geothermal. Wind.
Fuel burning.
Fossil fuels.
Hydroelectric power.
Yep. So the interesting thing about pretty much all these examples is that ultimately, if you trace it back, this power source did come from the sun. Maybe not so much nuclear, but nuclear is sort of a variation on what the sun does itself. So geothermal kind of comes from the stored heat in the earth, but things like wind, hydro, and even fossil fuels, those all initially start out as solar energy hitting the earth and either photosynthesis in the plants that were eaten by other animals that were eventually over geological time and turned into oil and coal and all that good stuff. And then, of course, wind is just the temperature differentials created by sunlight hitting the earth and creating wind currents. You have the water cycle powered by the sun that causes water to go and snow onto mountains or rain down on high hills that comes down in rivers, and then we can harness that as hydropower. So it's just interesting to note that the sun is truly the power source for everything on Earth, whether we harness it directly or whether we harness it through wind or hydro or other sources. And who can think of a way that sunlight has been used for hundreds of years, even before photovoltaics, like the solar cells we're going to put up today? What are some other ways that people have been using solar energy in the past? Agriculture, yeah. Cooking, solar cooking, yeah.
Drying clothes.
Perfect. That's a good one. Drying clothes, that's sort of the one I hope that people will say, because not everyone thinks of that. Everyone's used to throwing things in the dryer now. You say, did you know they come up with a solar-powered dryer? Yeah, and it's a little clothespin. Yeah. That's the way people have been using sunlight for hundreds of years, along with the other ones that you guys mentioned. But of course, today we're here to talk about photovoltaic, often abbreviated as PV, and we're not going to go into too much technical detail about how it happens, but basically the photons of sunlight hit the solar cells and are converted directly into solar energy. So it's a very direct conversion as opposed to something like fossil fuels that's very indirect and sort of borrowing energy from the past. This is creating energy in real time. And we're going to go into an intro to electricity as well, just to make sure that you guys know the terms associated with it. So what do we know about electricity? We know that electrons are part of the atom, and so there's the electrons right there on the outside. Electrons are normally stuck strongly to the atom. However, in a conductor, like metals, some of the electrons at least can move from atom to atom. And if you have a chain of them, if the three electrons are able to flow from one end of the chain to the other, we can use that flow of electrons to do work. And we use the words like flow and current because it's very common to basically use water analogies that tend to work fairly well when you're talking about electricity. In a lot of ways it is sort of similar to water. A water wheel uses the energy in flowing water to do work. The water is kind of flowing from a higher potential to a lower potential, and it does work along the way. That's what we do with electrical circuits. The energy flowing in electrons, called current, can be used to do work. And then there's two forms of current. You have direct current, which is where the water or the electrons are flowing in one direction, like a stream. Alternatively, you have alternating current, where it's going back and forth. So if you were digging for a water analogy, you might think of waves on the beach. The electricity normally goes through a wire, and a wire is nothing more than a conductor that's usually covered in some kind of insulation. The insulation keeps the electricity from going where it's not supposed to. And just kind of as a side note, people sort of understood the principles of electricity before they really were able to look closely at the atoms and understand what was the underlying, how it worked. But the convention is to talk about current is going from positive to negative. In reality, we know now that the electrons are the things that move, and the positive part of the atom stays in place. So it's actually the electrons moving from negative to positive, but it works all the same. Just to talk about it the traditional way of things going from positive to negative, all the math kind of works out the same. So you need some kind of force in order to make the current flow. Any guesses from the room what that force would be called?
Voltage.
Voltage, perfect. So voltage is what pushes the current from one end of the wire to the other. And voltage, to go back to the water analogy, is sort of similar to like water pressure. If you have a higher pressure on one side of the hose than you have on the other, the water is going to flow. So you can also imagine having a hose hooked up to two faucets, and if there's equal pressure, then no flow is going to happen. So what really matters is not an absolute voltage. What matters is the difference in potential between the two ends. So you need to have a voltage difference between 2 points in order to have current flow, and then of course you have to have a conductor in there. So if you have a conductor and you have a source of two different voltages, then that's the basic elements you need to have a circuit. So this is electricity the way we're used to seeing it. Plugs in the wall. Do you guys know is that AC or is that DC power? AC, correct. So PG&E delivers AC power to our homes. And what might be an example of DC electricity? Where would we see that?
In an automobile?
Automobile? Yeah.
Like a phone.
Phone? Yeah, cell phones.
Anything that uses a battery.
Exactly. Anything that uses a battery, whether it's your car or your phone, laptops, anything that has a battery. Batteries themselves are DC. So electronics that use batteries typically use DC power. You might plug them into an AC circuit, but there's some kind of converter that switches it from AC to DC for the sake of charging the battery. So battery produces DC power. Who knows how many volts are in a battery like this, like a AAA or a AA? 1.5, exactly. So 1.5 volts in a battery like this, and if you put a conductor between the two ends, then there's an example of having a voltage on one end and a different voltage on the other end, and you have a complete circuit. But this is not a great circuit because this is what's known as a short circuit. You don't have anything to slow the current down, so that there is some energy. There's a power source and there's energy going through the wire, and it's got to come out some way, and it comes out in the form of heating up the wire very quickly. And short circuits can lead to things like fires or just